The text message appeared 3 days ago. You've checked your phone 40 times since then, watching those 3 dots appear and disappear. You sent a follow-up yesterday. Casual, light, nothing desperate. Still nothing. The person who seemed so interested, who talked about future plans, who looked into your eyes and said they'd never felt this way before, has vanished. No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence that grows heavier by the hour. Ghosting has become a painfully common experience in modern dating, leaving the ghosted person wondering what they did wrong and tormenting themselves with possibilities. But what if the answer isn't about what you did at all? What if these painful relationship patterns have deeper psychological roots that date back to theories developed over a century ago? The revolutionary psychoanalytic theory that transformed our understanding of human behavior provides surprising insight into why relationships fail in predictable patterns. While these theories have evolved significantly since their inception, the core insights into how our unconscious mind drives our behavior remain profoundly relevant today, especially in understanding the complexities of modern dating. When someone disappears from your life without explanation, the natural tendency is to blame yourself. But understanding the psychological mechanisms at play reveals that ghosting and other relationship failures often have little to do with you and everything to do with unconscious forces operating beneath the surface of awareness. The unconscious mind is like an iceberg. The visible portion represents just a fraction of its true size and power. Beneath the surface lurks a vast repository of repressed desires, fears, and conflicts that influence our behavior in ways we rarely recognize. This invisible force shapes our relationship choices, triggers our defense mechanisms, and sometimes sabotages our chances at lasting connection. The pleasure principle drives us to seek immediate gratification and avoid discomfort at all costs. This fundamental psychological motivation explains why many people choose to disappear rather than engage in a difficult conversation about ending a relationship. When someone realizes they're not interested in continuing a connection, the prospect of delivering this news creates significant anxiety. Rather than face this discomfort, they opt for the path of least resistance: silence. Consider the common scenario where 2 people have been dating for several weeks. The chemistry seemed promising initially, but one person has begun to feel that the connection isn't right. Instead of having an honest conversation, they gradually reduce communication, take longer to respond to messages, and eventually stop replying altogether. The desire to avoid the anticipated pain of a breakup conversation outweighs their sense of obligation to provide closure. This avoidance behavior stems from the unconscious prioritization of immediate comfort over long-term integrity. The person ghosting isn't necessarily cruel or malicious. They're responding to a powerful psychological drive to minimize discomfort. Their unconscious mind has calculated that disappearing will cause less immediate distress than confronting the situation directly, even if this choice causes greater harm in the long run. For the person being ghosted, understanding this dynamic offers an important shift in perspective. The silence isn't a reflection of your worth, but rather a manifestation of the other person's inability to tolerate emotional discomfort. Their avoidance speaks volumes about their psychological functioning and capacity for healthy relating, information that, while painful to discover, ultimately spares you from a relationship with someone incapable of honest communication. The pleasure principle operates in more subtle ways throughout relationships as well. It explains why conversations about commitment often trigger avoidance behaviors, why discussions about the future might suddenly lead to emotional withdrawal, and why addressing problems in the relationship frequently results in changing the subject or picking fights about unrelated issues. When emotional intimacy creates discomfort, the unconscious mind seeks escape routes. Beyond the simple avoidance of discomfort lies the more complex mechanism of transference, the unconscious projection of feelings, expectations, and past experiences onto current relationships. We all carry the emotional imprints of our earliest attachments, particularly with parental figures, and these become templates for how we expect relationships to unfold. These templates operate largely outside our awareness, creating powerful emotional reactions that seem to emerge from nowhere. A person who experienced abandonment in childhood might interpret normal independence in a partner as the beginning of rejection. Someone whose parents made love conditional on achievement might perceive ordinary disagreements as threats to the entire relationship. These unconscious projections create distortions in how we perceive others' intentions and behaviors. In dating, transference manifests in predictable patterns. Consider the experience of meeting someone new and feeling an immediate, powerful connection that seems almost magical. While genuine chemistry exists, this overwhelming sense of familiarity often signals that transference is at work. The unconscious mind has recognized something in this new person that resonates with an important figure from the past, creating a sense of emotional recognition that far exceeds what the brief interaction would normally justify. This explains why we sometimes feel irrationally angry or hurt by relatively minor behaviors from a new partner. When someone arrives 15 minutes late for a date, and this triggers an intense emotional reaction that seems disproportionate, transference is likely operating. Perhaps the tardiness has activated an old wound around not being valued or prioritized, causing a present-day situation to become loaded with historical emotional significance. Transference also explains the common phenomenon where people repeatedly choose partners who treat them in ways that mirror childhood experiences, even when those experiences were painful. A person who grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent might unconsciously seek partners who are similarly distant, not because they enjoy the pain, but because the dynamic feels familiar. The unconscious mind often prioritizes the known over the unknown, even when the known is harmful. The pattern becomes particularly evident when someone consistently chooses partners with similar negative traits. The person who repeatedly dates controlling individuals, or who always seems to find themselves with partners who can't commit, is likely experiencing the powerful pull of transference. The unconscious mind is attempting to replay and potentially resolve old relationship dynamics by recreating them in the present. Ghosting takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of transference. When someone disappears without explanation, they may be responding not just to you, but to what you represent in their unconscious. Perhaps you've triggered associations with a relationship that caused them pain, activated their fear of abandonment, ironically causing them to abandon first, or simply brought them closer to intimacy than their psychological defenses could tolerate. Understanding transference doesn't erase the pain of being ghosted or experiencing relationship dysfunction, but it does provide critical context. The seemingly personal rejection often has little to do with your specific qualities and everything to do with the other person's unresolved emotional history. Their behavior reveals more about their psychological landscape than about your worthiness as a partner. Perhaps the most insidious way the unconscious sabotages relationships is through the mechanism of self-sabotage driven by an unconscious fear of intimacy. While most people consciously desire connection, many unconsciously fear it. This paradox explains why relationships often collapse precisely when they start to deepen, why success in dating frequently triggers self-destructive behaviors, and why some people seem perpetually stuck in a pattern of almost, but not quite, finding lasting love. The fear of intimacy stems from the vulnerability that deep connection requires. To truly bond with another person means lowering defenses, revealing authentic needs and feelings, and becoming emotionally dependent on someone we can't control. For the unconscious mind, this vulnerability registers as danger, particularly if past experiences have taught us that loving relationships aren't safe. Self-sabotage in relationships follows predictable patterns. Consider the person who starts picking fights when a relationship begins to deepen, suddenly finding flaws in a partner they previously idealized. Or the individual who cheats despite being in a fulfilling relationship, creating a problem that destroys the connection just as it was becoming more intimate. These behaviors often mystify the people engaging in them. They genuinely don't understand why they're acting against their own stated desires. The dating landscape is filled with subtler forms of self-sabotage as well. The tendency to focus on minor incompatibilities while overlooking significant positive qualities. The pattern of becoming attracted to people only when they show signs of pulling away. The habit of revealing too much too soon, creating an intensity that overwhelms new connections. Each represents the unconscious mind's attempt to protect itself from the perceived dangers of genuine intimacy. Ghosting can also function as a form of self-sabotage. When someone disappears from a promising relationship for reasons they themselves don't fully understand, they may be responding to unconscious anxiety about deepening intimacy. Rather than consciously deciding the relationship isn't right, they feel an inexplicable urge to flee that overpowers their rational mind. Later, they often regret this choice, but struggle to explain their behavior even to themselves. For those repeatedly experiencing the pain of being ghosted or finding themselves in dysfunctional relationship patterns, self-reflection becomes crucial. While each situation is unique, patterns that recur across multiple relationships may indicate unconscious factors at work. The person who consistently chooses unavailable partners, who always seems to get ghosted at the same stage of dating, or who finds themselves losing interest as soon as the other person shows genuine commitment, may be engaging in forms of self-sabotage driven by unconscious fears. Recognizing these patterns requires honest self-examination. What stage of relationships typically triggers problems? What qualities consistently attract you in others? And might these qualities relate to early relationship dynamics? Do you find yourself creating tests for partners to pass, setting impossible standards, or focusing on minor flaws when intimacy deepens? These questions can reveal the unconscious strategies that might be protecting you from vulnerability while simultaneously preventing the connection you desire. The awareness that these psychological mechanisms exist offers a pathway to change. Once we recognize the unconscious forces shaping our relationship choices and reactions, we can begin to intervene in patterns that previously seemed beyond our control. This doesn't mean the influence of the unconscious mind disappears. These forces remain powerful, but awareness creates space to respond differently. For those who've experienced the pain of being ghosted, understanding these psychological dynamics provides meaningful comfort. The silence that felt so personally rejecting now appears as evidence of the other person's psychological limitations. Their inability to communicate directly reveals their constraints, not your unworthiness. This perspective doesn't eliminate disappointment, but it redirects the pain away from self-blame and toward a more accurate understanding of what actually occurred. This shift in understanding proves particularly valuable in addressing the self-doubt that ghosting typically triggers. Rather than endlessly reviewing what you might have done wrong, you can recognize that the other person's behavior likely resulted from their unconscious conflicts around intimacy, their transference reactions that had little to do with your actual qualities, or simply their inability to tolerate the discomfort of direct communication. Their disappearance becomes information about their psychological functioning, not a judgment of your value. With this insight comes freedom. Freedom from the tendency to internalize others' limitations as evidence of your flaws. Freedom from the cycle of self-recrimination that follows relationship disappointments. Freedom to recognize patterns in your own choices and behaviors that might be unconsciously sabotaging the connections you seek. Bringing these unconscious processes into awareness requires courage. Examining your patterns, particularly around how and why relationships end, might reveal uncomfortable truths about your own fears of intimacy or unresolved emotional needs. You might discover that you've been unconsciously choosing unavailable partners, creating conflicts when vulnerability increases, or finding other subtle ways to maintain emotional distance, even while consciously seeking connection. This self-knowledge, while sometimes painful to acquire, creates the possibility of different choices. You might begin to recognize when transference is coloring your perceptions, when you're avoiding discomfort at the expense of authentic communication, or when fear of intimacy is triggering self-sabotaging behaviors. This awareness doesn't instantly transform patterns that have developed over decades, but it introduces a crucial moment of choice, where previously there was only automatic reaction. The path forward involves developing a more conscious relationship with these previously unconscious processes. This might mean pausing when intense emotions arise in dating situations to question whether present circumstances truly justify the reaction or whether old wounds are being activated. It might mean recognizing when the desire to disappear from a relationship stems from fear rather than genuine incompatibility. It might mean noticing patterns in the partners you choose and consciously expanding your concept of who might be right for you. For those dealing with the aftermath of being ghosted, this perspective offers both compassion and empowerment. Compassion comes from recognizing that the experience, while painful, wasn't a reflection of your worth, but rather a manifestation of psychological dynamics largely beyond your control. Empowerment comes from using the experience as information about what you truly want in relationships and how you might recognize similar patterns earlier in the future. The unconscious mind remains a powerful force in our relationship choices and behaviors, but its influence need not be destiny. By bringing awareness to these previously invisible processes, we create the possibility of relationships based more on present reality than on unconscious projections and fears. The silence of ghosting, once a source of painful self-doubt, becomes instead an opportunity for deeper self-understanding and ultimately more fulfilling connections. The next time your phone remains silent after what seemed like a promising connection, remember that the story isn't about your inadequacy, but about the complex psychological forces that shape human behavior. In that understanding lies not just comfort, but the wisdom to approach future relationships with greater awareness, compassion, and authenticity.